Hi, everyone. So today we're moving on to section 3, which is titled Changing Attitudes and Values During the Industrial Era. And today we're going to really be asking ourselves, how did the Industrial Revolution change the old social order and the long-held traditions of the Western world? So the things to be looking for in this video is what values shaped this new social order and what the new social order is. You should also understand how women and educators, they're seeking change, and then the way science was challenging long-held existing beliefs during this period as well. So if we look at this new social order, you see three different social classes emerging. You know before that you had the rich landowners and the peasants and the clergy. Think back to when we were studying the French Revolution, right? The different estates. Those were the old social order. So now the new social order are the rich business families. They're on top and they're the upper class. You have the middle class. These are business people and professionals, lawyers, doctors. They may be some small business owners that are kind of, working their way up. You also start to see an emerging lower middle class. These would be people like teachers and office workers, like secretaries, people like that. And then the very bottom rung is the working poor, also known as the proletariat. So if we look at some of the values of these people, these classes, especially the middle classes, middle class values. First is etiquette. Etiquette is like what's polite social behavior. This is where you get this tradition of, not wearing hats inside of buildings, because everybody wore a hat back then, and it was considered good etiquette to remove your hat when you're inside. And that tradition has kind of continued to this day. As far as children, they're expected to be seen and not heard. They're supposed to be well behaved. You also see the middle class seeing servants as a sign that you're keeping up with the Joneses. It's a way that, even really small households wanted to have at least a cook and a housemaid to show that they were in the middle class, to show their status. The ideal home, you have a mom who is the housewife and the perfect wife. And so when we get to this, that's known as the cult of domesticity, which again is this idealized idea of women and the home, women almost seen as part of the home. But we get these stereotyped roles of what men and women are supposed to be, what women are supposed to do, what men are supposed to do. Now, the thing is, to keep in mind is that this isn't the way of life for working class women. Working class women are working alongside of their husbands 12 to 14 hours a day. So this is really a middle class and upper middle class idea, really. Women are starting to work for their rights as well during this period, during the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, especially in the United States and in Europe. Some of the things that they're looking for is just legal equality. So, for example, that would be like for weddings or for marriage and for divorce and property laws, that they are able to have the same rights and the same expectations as husbands in terms of being able to file for divorce and be able to inherit property and those types of things. You also see a growing temperance movement, especially in the United States, to ban the sale and production of alcohol. And you will certainly talk more about that in U.S. history next year. So some of the early voices are Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, who was an African-American suffragist, and her picture's on the right here on this slide. And this, by suffragist, I mean that she fought for the right for women to vote. And what's interesting is that many of the women who fought for women's rights had actually also fought against slavery as well, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so the other thing you see for women is the right to vote, right? Also known as women's suffrage. And that's going to be a growing call in both Europe and in the United States during the Industrial Revolution. When we look at the Western United States, so for example, Wyoming, Montana, some of those places, they end up granting women the right to vote long before some of the Eastern, Midwestern, Southern states do. And that's just going to increase the call for more and more states to give women the right to vote. And of course, you're going to learn more about that in detail next year as well. Of course, many people opposed women getting the right to vote. They would say things like women were either too emotional or needed to be protected from the dirtiness of politics, or that women belonged in the home, not in government. Basically, they were saying that women were supposedly too fragile. However, women like Sojourner Truth argued against this idea, saying, nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman, right? So she's like, what the heck? And part of that was because she was also African American. She had faced discrimination. But also she's like saying, don't act like women got it all great here and that we need to be protected when this is how, especially you white men, treat me, right? You won't help me out. So don't pretend that you're doing this to protect women from the dirtiness of politics. During this time, public education is going to grow, and there's a variety of reasons for this. One is that the ability to read and write and do math, most people think are going to make them better citizens. Now, on top of that, when you look at the factory system and the school system, and these two pictures kind of illustrate it right here, they look pretty similar to me, don't you? Don't you think? A lot of people viewed education as the way to train future workers and to teach children the rules and the expectations of being a worker. So those are the things that people are instilling in their children. Those are the things that are being instilled in these kids in schools that will then help them be successful factory workers. As more and more countries believe that you need to have kids who can read and write and do math, you're going to get more public school systems. Now, the other thing is they want to make sure that teachers are better trained. So you're going to have these normal schools, which is the same thing as teaching schools. And you're going to see more and more mandatory attendance, at least to a certain age. As you get more people going to high school, more people graduate from high school, then you're going to need more colleges and universities to be able to take on all these kids who are trained to be able to go on to the next step if they wanted to. And so all of that is growing during that time. Now, the other thing you start to see is that all girls' schools start too. So girls also have an access to higher education. But the other thing too is, if these businesses are growing, you need to have a really trained workforce, like in terms of accountants, for example, these professional workers that need more than just a high school diploma. They also need to go on and get more training. So you see this call, this call is growing for a better trained workforce. We also start to see science as well taking a new direction. Here, though, you can see, before I talk about science, here's a graph, changes in real wages based on education, right? And you can see the level of education has increased almost universally, right? So again, public schools have improved. You have normal schools, which are teaching colleges. So they start to require better standards for teaching. And countries begin to require it's mandatory attendance again for schools, for students to go to school. And it's all a desire for a more educated workforce, for people to work in the factories, right? So again, science, we start to see science taking a new direction. So as they're learning more things, as they're building on the learning of the past, you start to see, for example, Dalton coming up with this theory that, everything is made up of atoms. You also have a Russian scientist who creates the periodic table of elements during this period. And more discoveries are really going to cause people to kind of question the age of the Earth even. And you've got a couple different things that are going on. You've got Charles Lyell, who looks at the layers of the Earth. He looks at all the landforms, and he realizes that the Earth cannot be a couple thousand years old. It has to be much older than that, because if we look at the effects of erosion, it takes a lot longer than what the Bible would have said that the Earth was created in. The other thing is you start to see is more and more discoveries. So as people become more curious about things and they start to excavate things, you see archaeology finding Neanderthals. And these discoveries cause them to question, well, where did they come from? Where did they go? And Charles Darwin is going to come up with this theory of natural selection, this idea that certain characteristics make animals and plants and a variety of species better adapted at surviving. And because they survive, they pass on those traits to their offspring, and their offspring inherit those traits. And over the course of generations and centuries, that's how evolution works, right? The best traits are passed on, and the worst ones are die out because those species do not reproduce, right? Now, the problem with this theory of natural selection is that some people are going to apply Darwinism, his theory of evolution, the ideas of Darwinism, to society. And it's going to lead to this idea of racism, that unscientific idea that certain groups are more fit than others, simply based on the color of their skin, that certain groups are more evolved than others. That's racism. And it's going to lead to this idea of society's survival of the fittest. And that's going to cause a whole lot of a whole host of problems that we're still actually kind of dealing with right now. Now, religion also changes. It needs to step up actually in the Industrial Revolution. So they're looking at the fact that through laissez-faire economics, people aren't receiving the help that they need from government. And when they look at those people who are living in the inner cities, they believe that there's a spiritual gap that religion needs to reach out to and to fill. And so you have this movement called the social gospel movement that forms. And the social gospel movement was a movement of Christians, specifically Protestant Christians, who urged their followers of Christianity, to social service. And so you start to see religion taking on the job of government, of social work, providing housing, healthcare, education, providing, for example, in the United States, providing English classes to immigrant workers so that they're better adapted to surviving in American society. And they really serve that role of giving them the social services that they need, that the government had not been providing itself. So that's going to be it for this lesson. Let me know if you need any more explanation on something, or if you have any questions, and I'll be sure to help you out.